What it do, YouTube? I am your boy Tony Vogue, the E-Boy, Zombie Slayer. And I like to be unbiased with my perspective, so not to be a climate change alarmist, but y'all remember El Nino? We studied it in school, at least in Canada.
Oh.
Well, apparently El Nino will do some shit
Life
to
on
the
Earth
Earth
is full
in
of cyclical
2024.
variations.
Let's
We
find
have
out.
day and night, the changing of the seasons, and the ebb and flow of the tides. Many of these changes happen over relatively short periods and can be predicted with precision, but other cycles affect our planet over large intervals and can be trickier to forecast. In a previous video, I discussed the role Milankovitch cycles play in the occurrence of ice ages interrupted by warming intervals, but given the vast timeline, it's unlikely our own lives will be very affected by them. Yet, there is one climate cycle that definitely will affect you: the El Nino Southern Oscillation, better known as El Nino
It's a Southern
and La Nina.
Oscillation.
While El Nino and La Nina originate in the Pacific Ocean, their impacts are felt nearly everywhere on Earth.
Yeah,
And
but
by
what
some
do they do?
accounts, the strongest effects are getting more common. In the last few decades, some of
It
the
doesn't help
destructive
us if you don't tell
consequences
us
have
what they
included
do.
flooding, drought, famine,
Okay.
and mass die-offs of marine life. Indeed,
Well,
a
hopefully
severe
not
El
the
Nino in
diatoms, which
1998
we learned about
caused
on
an
this
estimated
channel.
16% of
Ah.
the world's coral reefs to die, kicking off a cataclysmic mass bleaching event that persists to this day. The ENSO is global and will, without a doubt, impact you. So what are El Nino and La Nina?
I don't
Why
know,
are
bro.
they linked? And what are their global impacts?
So, drop in the comments below if you learned about El Nino or La Nina at some point in your education and where you're at, please.
I'm Alex McColgan and you're watching Astrum. Join me today as we look at a fascinating climate cycle
We getting
that
to
became
that
the stuff
Astrum.
of legend centuries before we had the science to explain it. If you think the name El Nino sounds more like a folk story than a scientific phenomenon, you're onto something. During the 17th century, fishermen noticed periods of warmer water and poor fishing that would peak around Christmas time. They called it El Nino de la Navidad, which means the boy of the nativity or the Christmas child. It wasn't until the late 19th and
Christmas
early
child,
20th centuries
okay.
that scientists began to connect a variety of seemingly disconnected regional events scattered across the planet. By the mid-20th century, they found that these weren't regional occurrences, but phases of a global, cyclical phenomenon called the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The ENSO fluctuates
Okay.
with an average
That's
interval
what
of
an
5
ENSO
years,
is.
although the cycle can take anywhere between 2 and 7 years. We've now been tracking these cycles for decades, but they've been around for much longer than that. To understand why the El Nino Southern Oscillation occurs, let's first look at what happens in the Pacific Ocean under normal conditions. Winds blow along the equator from east to west. This is a product of the Coriolis effect, caused by the Earth's rotation. Here's a fun fact: if the Earth didn't rotate, air would circulate north to south, from the high pressure poles to the warmer, low pressure region at the equator.
Okay.
As it happens, air does circulate off the poles, but it bends as it approaches the equator. In a circumferential band that extends 30 degrees north and south of the equator, sometimes known as the horse latitudes, air in the northern hemisphere deflects
horse
to the
latitudes.
southwest, and
Is
air
that
in the
because
southern
that's where
hemisphere
horses
deflects
be?
to the northwest. This channel of westward moving air is called the trade winds. It turns out they're not just important if you're a pirate living in the 18th century. As the trade winds blow westerly across the Pacific Ocean, they drag warm water from coastal South America toward Asia. And as this warm water moves west,
Look at all the
water
learning we do here, YouTube. You gotta smash subscribe. Drop a thumbs up.
rises to replace it, a phenomenon called upwelling. This cold water is rich in nutrients that feed phytoplankton, which in turn support ecosystems of fish and everything that feeds off them. So, as you can imagine, a shock to this system would have a major domino effect on marine life. If this is what normal conditions look like in the Pacific Ocean, think of El Nino as a disruption of normal. During El Nino, the trade winds weaken. As they slow down, warm water that would be flowing toward Asia builds up instead near the coastal Americas, resulting in less upwelling cold water. This, in turn, creates a zone of warm air and water further east in the Pacific. With less upwelling, the fish that feed off the phytoplankton migrate or die. The Pacific jet stream that crosses North America moves south from where it normally occurs. As a result, the northern United States and Canada tend to become warmer and drier, whereas the Gulf Coast and parts of the coastal South America become wetter. Peru and Ecuador receive their wettest months from April to October, and during more severe El Nino years, rain and flooding in those regions can be catastrophic. In the severe El Nino of 1997,
I wonder what effects this has for cocaine production. For the cocaine, man.
To 1998, devastating floods bombarded Peru, collapsing bridges and burying entire shanty towns under a meter-thick layer of mud.
Not the cocaine.
In total, 250,000 people were displaced from their homes. The region of Tumbes, which is normally arid, received an unbelievable 16 times its average annual rainfall.
Oh, bomba cloud.
Outside the Americas, El Nino sets off a series of domino effects that significantly alters weather worldwide. The increased rainfall in South America typically coincides with a pronounced period of drought in South Asia and Australia. Severe famines have been recorded in India, and a delay in Australia's monsoon season can lead to massively destructive bushfires.
Well, let's see if this shit is accurate.
Due to its vast expanses of grassland, Australia's bushfires are some of the most destructive on Earth, and there are already concerns about an event that could occur late in 2023. Leaders are understandably worried given recent warming trends. You may remember that in 2020, in a non-El Nino year, bushfires wrought nightmarishly apocalyptic scenes that left 50 million acres of land charred to a crisp. Australia is a literal tinderbox over which El Nino looms like a proverbial flamethrower, so local officials are wise to prepare for the worst. On a global scale, the average surface temperature during El Nino rises 0.1 degrees Celsius. But not all El Nino events are severe. Some can be rather mild, something to keep in mind before you hit the panic button. The average El Nino lasts from 9 to 12 months, but on rare occasions they have lasted for years. The world's climate is a pretty complex system responding to a number of inputs, so the effects of El Nino are best understood as relative to what the baseline would be, which is why no two El Nino years are alike. La Niña is the opposite side of the El Nino Southern Oscillation.
La Niña.
If El Nino is a hot event, then La Niña is a cool one, although some regions do experience warming. As I mentioned earlier, El Nino occurs when the equatorial trade winds slacken, but during La Niña, the trade winds become even stronger. Think of El Nino as a disruption of normal and La Niña as normal plus. The trade winds blow even more warm water from coastal South America toward Asia, resulting in more upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water near the Americas. For fisheries, this can produce a feeding frenzy. And if you like salmon, well, you're in luck. During La Niña, cold water species like salmon will venture into typically warmer waters where they can't ordinarily survive. The same is also true of squid, in case you prefer calamari. Meanwhile, in Asia, the influx of warm equatorial water produces wet conditions, the opposite of the drought experienced during El Nino, causing a spike in tropical cyclones.
El Nino and La Niña.
In North America, the jet stream is pushed further north.
More important than you thought.
This causes drought in the southwestern United States and rains in the Pacific Northwest. In 2022, La Niña exacerbated a mega drought in the southwest United States, making it the worst in 1,200 years. Just look at this image of Lake Mead, where the Hoover Dam is located. That light area is the so-called bathtub ring, ordinarily covered by water.
Ooh.
Now, with all this talk of trade winds and jet streams, you might be wondering how La Nina affects hurricane season.
God
Well,
damn.
depending on
La
where you live,
Nina
the news is either good or
everything
bad.
up here.
The Atlantic often experiences a much more severe hurricane season during La Nina because the shift in the jet stream produces greater atmospheric instability in the southern Atlantic. But the Pacific Basin actually sees fewer hurricanes, a sign of how drastically different these regional effects can be. Just don't get too complacent, Pacific dwellers. El Nino has the opposite effect as La Nina. Meanwhile, in Pacific coastal South America, you won't see the warm Christmas-time waters that once prompted fishermen to dub it El Niño de la Navidad. Indeed, there's a reason why fishermen once called La Nina El Viejo, or the Old Man. During La Nina, the weather in Peru and Chile turns colder and drier, sometimes producing severe periods of drought. Brazil's north, on the other hand, becomes wetter during the months from December to February, and the lowlands of Bolivia can receive catastrophic flooding.
Bolivia.
In Africa, the conditions in La Nina years are basically the reverse of what they are during El Nino. East Africa tends to experience drier than average conditions, whereas the south tends to be wetter than average. So, where are we now in the ENSO cycle? As for the making of this video,
where are we now? The metaphorical question.
National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has declared an end to a lengthy 1.5-year La Nina. They concluded this based on measuring the difference in surface atmospheric pressure in the western and eastern Pacific, a metric known as the Equatorial Southern Oscillation Index. The last reading of it was just 0.1, down from 1 a year ago, meaning conditions have returned pretty much to normal.
Alright,
it's
so
still
there's
early
no
to say
oscillation?
anything definitive, but there are already indications that an El Nino will occur later in 2023.
El Nino.
Currently, the NOAA is forecasting a 60% chance that El Nino sets in by autumn. This would have major ramifications, and India is already warning its citizens of potential drought conditions. There's another reason to expect an El Nino in 2023, albeit based purely on past experience. Since we started tracking in the 1950s, there has never been more than a 4-year period without an El Nino event. So if there isn't one in 2023, it would mark the first 5-year gap without one. For me, this is an excellent example of how studying climate cycles can help us prepare and foster human survival, not just on this world, but potentially on other worlds too. Because one of the fascinating aspects of the ENSO is the level of insight we gain from it into Earth's complex climate systems. Understanding the interconnectivity of our own planet's climate will be crucial if we ever want to settle on other planets or even terraform. If humans eventually undertake the huge task of terraforming Mars, Mercury, Venus, or the Moon, or perhaps even an exoplanet in some other part of the Milky Way galaxy,
let's terraform
our success will likely
exoplanets.
depend on our ability to understand the various inputs and feedback loops that intricately interlink climate systems and biospheres.
That's smart.
That day may seem far off, but it isn't too early to start dreaming.
I don't think so.
So, there we have it, an in-depth primer on the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The ENSO can be
the ENSO. The El Nino Southern Oscillation. Now you can see smart in front of your friend.
A very destructive cycle for our planet's animal and human populations, but life is nothing if not adaptable. Likelier than not, 2023 will add another piece to the growing body of documentation about these events. How has El Nino or La Nina affected you? Have you noticed any interesting changes in your part of the world?
Year we'll know.
I'd love to hear about it in the comments. As I was researching for
the El Nino Southern Oscillation, you can look smart in front of your friends. I am your boy Tony Vogue, the E-Boy Zombie Slayer. Ha! You gotta subscribe, man.